What is the priority of thermal optic capability for the prepared citizen? That's the question that I'm going to attempt to answer in this video, because we speculate quite often about how this technology will be used in a long-term emergency scenario, but based on what's happening right now in real-life situations, we can apply that information to our preparedness purposes and get some better ideas about how we might use these devices if SHTF or anything along those lines ever occurs. Now, full disclosure, DNT Optic sent me this Hydra HS325 for testing and evaluation. And I'm using this optic as my example for this conversation because it's very versatile and it mostly covers what you'll probably need in a preparedness scenario. So I will have information about it down in the description as well as in the pinned comment. I'll go ahead and talk about the details of these optics a little bit further into the video. And of course, there is a discount code. Magic will get you 10% off if you decide to purchase this one once you have more of that information. But let's talk about the most likely use cases for civilians with thermal, okay? So number one would be search and rescue and surveillance and recon. Why is that? Often we think about thermals being integrated into weapon systems, but in reality, they're more useful in other roles, especially based on standard emergencies. And when I say that, what I mean is what police are using them for right now is likely what we may need them for during some sort of collapse event. So police use these to find suspects, right? We see them chasing high-speed chase suspects with thermals mounted to helicopters. We see them finding people under crawl spaces using thermal technology, and it's just very useful for that purpose. So I think search for either someone who is lost that you need to find in like a wilderness environment, or searching for someone who shouldn't be where they are is a very valuable thing to have access to during an emergency. Not to mention the rescue aspect of finding somebody who needs help. Sometimes they can't reach out or they don't have a way of signaling, and thermal is going to be a much easier way to find them than just about any other optical system. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is surveillance and recon. During a long-term emergency, you want to be able to anticipate incoming threats, and thermal will give you that information far beyond and much sooner than any other optical system, because those heat signatures are very hard to hide. And so that way you can see that something is coming your way. You might not be able to positively identify it, but you know there's something headed your way that maybe shouldn't be, and now you can be on higher alert. The same thing can be said about reconnaissance, because thermal provides you with a lot of data. You might be able to tell if there's vehicles somewhere where they usually aren't, or if vehicles have been running recently or not, or you can tell if somebody's trying to hide their thermal signature because they're aware of the fact that thermal might be employed. There's a lot of different ways that the surveillance and reconnaissance aspect of thermals can be applied for emergency preparedness that have nothing to do with combat scenarios or using weapons or anything along those lines. And I honestly think that's the most likely use case for thermal technology. Search and rescue and surveillance and recon. They give you tons of data, they're very intuitive, and they do a very good job of alerting you to things where maybe they shouldn't be. So let's talk about this particular optic in that regard. This optic works for that purpose because it's a handheld monocular. So you can take it with you wherever you need, and you can use it to search or surveil or do whatever you need to find out if there's a thermal signature nearby. It also allows you to zoom from 2x to 8x for this particular model. They have other models with additional zoom ranges, but 2x to 8x means I can zoom in on something if I can't quite make out what it is, and hopefully get a better positive identification in the process. It also is relatively high resolution, which I find to be beneficial because the higher the resolution you can afford, which is often the main price difference in these devices, is that the resolution is either going to be really low or really high, and that's where you're going to pay the biggest difference. So the more resolution you can get, the more information you can collect while you're using the device. And this one has a decent resolution, being right in the middle of the road, because this is the middle optic in the sense of price and cost compared to the other models available. Now, another great thing about it is that you could integrate it with a tripod, so you could have it as a standalone surveillance system. So that way it could be just part of some kind of like security outpost or some sort of surveillance arena that you're using it for. And in that same vein, you can actually use it for video recording. So you can actually record what it is you're watching, so you can bring that information back to anyone else that's in your team or your family and share with them what it is you saw and give them some important data, and they might be able to pick something up off of that recorded footage that you can't. So there's always the benefit of having a second set of eyes. Not to mention, you can just keep that for information contained for future references, right? And what's also cool about that concept of using it as like a standalone surveillance device, especially when you implement something like a tripod and make it in more of like a permanent stationary scenario, is that it can use an external power supply. So you can plug it in with a USB-C into some sort of other power unit, maybe like a solar backup generator or something like that, and it can maintain power for extremely long periods of time at that point because it's not reliant on battery. So all those things are very beneficial for why this optic works for that number one most likely use case, not to mention it's less than 14 ounces. So, and that's with all the models. They range between like 13 and like 13.7 or something like that. Regardless, they're all under 14 ounces. So for less than a pound, you have a lot of capability in your hands in the sense of search and rescue and surveillance and recon. So that, in my opinion, is the most likely use case for thermal in an SHTF or emergency type event. And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be in conjunction with a weapon system, because weapon systems, although they're very important and obviously we're going to need access to forms of self-defense, the likelihood of needing them is lower than the likelihood of needing to find somebody who got themselves into a bad situation or anticipate somebody coming onto your property that shouldn't be, or anything along those lines, right? So what's the second most likely use case for civilians with thermal? That's going to be hunting and pest control. Now, hunting is, I guess, just along the lines of making sure you have access to hunt regardless of what time of day it is, which thermal does a great job of allowing you to hunt day or night. And during an emergency, it might not make a difference what your usual hunting regulations are. So just keep that in mind. And then the pest control aspect is, of course, something that's more relevant to people who have property, but you still have to maintain your property and deal with pests, especially if you have livestock or if you're raising poultry or anything along those lines. We know that there's always things out there that want to eat the animals you're trying to raise. So first off, hunting allows you to harvest food, and it's also good because as a standalone rifle optic, which this particular thermal optic can be because it has reticles and zeroing and everything else related to that, it also gives you that backup redundancy of an optical system. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's say your main optic goes down, like in this case I have an ACOG here. Well, this not only functions in the configuration you see it as right now, but it also functions as a standalone scope. So you have the ability to switch it to that standalone mode if needed, because, well, you might need it. So I think that's a benefit. We like redundancy here in the preparedness community, and I think that having that access, even if you're not using it as a scope most of the time, is just a good thing. The other thing to keep in mind is that it has multiple reticles for the hunting aspect with multiple color palettes, and you can save your zeros in multiple profiles, which means you can actually have a ton of different zeros saved for a ton of different cartridges or rifle setups or whatever else you might be using it for. So I find that to be extremely beneficial as well, and I think that, in all honesty, it's nice to have something that can serve that function, even if it's not your main reason for why you have it, which, like I just said, it's not the number one priority for thermal use for civilians during a preparedness related situation, but I think it has a lot of merits regarding why it's still good in that role. Now, it also comes with an eye cover, so that can be beneficial for hunting as well, just to kind of make it more like a standalone scope and make it a little bit easier to manage when it comes to light and everything else related to your signature. So, and clearly you can use it as a scope in some sort of a combat scenario, but that's not what I would want to use in a combat scenario, because I want my optics to be of a certain capability day or night, and I don't want them to be electronically dependent, which this technically is, right? So what's the third most likely scenario where you'll need a thermal in an emergency, especially as a civilian? And now we're at the combat scenarios. Now, why is it number 3? Well, combat's going to be unlikely no matter what. And if you do find yourself in some sort of a scenario where you need self-defense and you're in a firefight, the likelihood of needing thermal technology and anything above and beyond your basic, AR-15 or handgun is pretty low. So if we're in a situation where we're using thermal optics for self-defense purposes in a long-term emergency, a lot of things have gone very bad, and you're going to be very glad you have it, but it's going to take a lot to get us to that point. So that's why I don't think it's the number one priority, but I think it's a great technology to have access to, much like night vision in the sense of using it in a combat role. So why is it beneficial for combat, especially in this clip-on configuration I have it in right now? Well, first off, you can engage otherwise unseen enemies. So you gain advantage in hostile environments, right? You can see people possibly before they see you. You can identify threats before they know you're there, or you can just see them coming while they also already know where you are, but it gives you a little bit more advantage than not being aware at all, right? And it does allow you to see things that you otherwise would not. So I think that's extremely important. Not to mention you can perceive things like an ambush or something along those lines. And then in a combat scenario, especially with this optic, you have that versatility. So throw it in a clip-on, great. You don't need it as a clip-on in the moment, throw it in your pack, use it as a binocular, great. Then if you want to use it on your rifle as a dedicated optic for a specific mission set, you can do that too. So I think that's also a great thing to consider when it comes to this particular optic, but also just thermals in general for preparedness use case scenarios. Now, this is a clip-on function right now, and it works as a clip-on by using the American Defense Manufacturing AD170S, which is like a bipod quick detach mount. So it's a bipod adapter for Picatinny rail. And what that allows for is to obviously clip it on and off and make it easier to move around from one platform to the next. But you do need to use an optic riser in order to accomplish that. A 1/2 inch seems to be working perfectly for me, but just based on your system and your scope height and everything else, you might have to adjust that. So this ACOG works with this as a clip-on. Now, you don't see ACOGs used in that role all the time, but they are obviously capable of it. But this thing is definitely more geared towards an LPVO. If you had a 1X, it's gonna be a lot more efficient than having a 4X, just because of the way the menu settings work and everything else. But I've been easily able to use it in conjunction with the ACOG on 4X and still hit targets and still zero it and take care of everything that I needed to do. So it really does work in that clip-on, whether or not you have a 4X or an LPVO or anything 4X and below. I don't think it would work well on like a larger magnified scope, especially once you go above 4X, it's over. So just keep that in mind, but it does do that in the sense of a combat role of being a clip-on very well. Now, here's the other thing. This zeroing's easily accomplished because you have a freeze mode, so then you can freeze and then just move the center of the screen to where the impact is in regards to your reticle. So your reticle basically will move, or the image will move to your reticle on where the impact was. And the way I accomplished that was just by shooting at something that had a colder heat signature, and then the impact of the round left a heat signature, so I was able to just freeze and see that and move it over. So it worked quite well. Now, you have profile saves and everything else, so you can actually do this with multiple optics. So if you want to clip it on to different rifles and use different optics, you can easily do that as well. And it does have swappable batteries, which I find useful too, because it uses 18650 flat top batteries. But I wanted to have this conversation about the most likely use cases for prepared citizens first, because I think that we maybe over-exaggerate the weapon system combat needs of thermal versus, like I said, search and rescue and surveillance and recon. And having a device that can do number 1 is probably more important than having a device that can do number 3. But having a device that can do both is actually what you probably want. And that's why I really like what I'm working with right here with the DNT Hydra. So this thing's also combat ready in a few other ways. And when I say that, I mean, I don't know. I haven't taken it into combat, right? I'm not a veteran. I'm not in law enforcement. I don't have any of that background or experience. But what I can say is that it has a -4 degree Fahrenheit to a 122 degree Fahrenheit operating temperature, because those are real words. And then it's also IP67 waterproof, which, by the way, apparently we're testing right now, and I have zero doubts it's gonna be just fine. So that's also good to know, which is one of the reasons why I have it out here, and I don't care that it's raining because I'm not worried about it. I have confidence that it's gonna work just fine. So all those things go into its favor for being in that role, but serving the other 2 priorities first, which means that I don't have to sacrifice anything to have one or the other, which I really like about this particular optic. All right, so let's talk about some of the things that I would like to see changed or updated with this optic in a future Gen 2 version of it, because they're not necessarily deal breakers, but they're things that I want you to be aware of before you make a purchase decision, just because you might find that to be slightly disappointing, and I don't want you to go in blind, right? And I've already talked to my rep at DNT Optics about these possible changes, so they're aware of them, but at the same time, like I said, I don't think they're deal breakers. breakers, and I still think this Optic is worth it, especially at its price point, but I want you to be fully aware of everything first before you make a decision, right? So the first thing is that there's an LED light here on top of the Optic that glows blue. Now, it's a power indicator, which is useful for certain scenarios. So if you're worried about the first most likely use case for prepared citizens being search and rescue or surveillance and recon, having that indicator lets you visually identify that the unit is on, and you don't have to go looking into the screen or anything else, so you're ready to use it at a moment's notice, and I do like that about it. But of course, in a combat scenario under night vision, it's very obvious that you have something on your gun and it lights up and basically is a signal to anybody else around you using night vision that somebody's there. So that's problematic for that reason, and it is something that I think they could easily fix. I would like it to either be able to be turned off in the software, which I think is probably the right option, or at the bare minimum, maybe just taken out completely. But regardless, you can fix it yourself as well. You could easily use some tape to cover it up, or maybe some nail polish or something, but there's remedies and it's not that big of a deal, and that's why I don't think it's a deal breaker, but it is something that you definitely need to be aware of, because for night vision, that could be a problem. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that this thing has Wi-Fi and app capabilities. So you can actually, hook it into Wi-Fi and use your app and do all kinds of stuff, but I don't do any of that. So look, I'm not even gonna tell you about the app or the software and stuff because I just don't use it. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not really interested in it. And of course, for some of you all, and maybe myself included because I'm a paranoid weirdo, having that connectivity is kind of questionable if there was ever like a combat scenario, because it makes you wonder if there was like, any type of backdoor system or kill switch or anything like that that could affect it. I know that's very, very unlikely, but it is possible. And I think that that's something that might turn some people off. So one thing that you should be aware of though is that you can just turn off that setting in the software so that it doesn't connect to Wi-Fi or anything along those lines. It is a manual setting you have to activate. So I think that's fine. And I'm not necessarily mad that they did that, because they're trying to make it user-friendly and trying to make it, as universally acceptable for everybody, not just people like myself who plan for weird events that may never occur. But it is something that I think people would raise some concern about because of the Chinese origin of the Optic and the fact that we all know those possibilities exist. Now, funny enough, a quick story for you. I did ask my rep at DNT Optics about that, and I was like, well, how do I know there's not like a kill switch in there? Or how do I know you guys don't just shut them off if there's ever a war? And their response was pretty funny, because you can tell they just don't even think about that kind of stuff, and they were just like, what? Like, what do you mean? But I had to ask because I knew some of you might, and according to them, as long as it's not connected to Wi-Fi or set up in that form or fashion, there's no way anyone could access it from the outside anyway. And so, hey, at least they answered my question and they didn't take it personally. Personally is not the right word for that, but regardless, I thought it was pretty funny, and I'm glad they entertained me, even if they completely lied to my face, which I don't believe, but hey, you never know. So, just something to mention. See? This is what being a fringe weirdo is all about. Now, the last thing that I think could be improved on this Optic, or might just be something that, would just improve overall usability of it, but isn't necessarily like a problem, is that on the clip-on menu, you really only have the capability of using it, especially in this 2X model. So I'm sure in the cheaper that starts at 3X, it's probably not even usable on certain magnifications. And on the more expensive model, it might not be as big of an issue, but at least on the 2X model, in the clip-on mode, when you're trying to adjust the zero for your clip-on, because basically what you have to do is you have to look through your Optic and you have to take a shot, and then you have to adjust the screen to match up with, your reticle being centered where your impacts are, so you can zero it properly with the Optic. So, and that does work quite well, actually. I haven't had any issues getting on target once I had that zero complete, but the issue is that at 4X, with an ACOG or something similar, the clip-on menu is a little bit hard to read and a little bit hard to see what's happening with. So what I did was I just memorized the button layout for how to adjust the reticle, or not the reticle, but the clip-on settings, because the adjustment situation there using the program is the same as what you use with a rifle reticle as well. So it's very similar, there's no issues there. But regardless, the clip-on menu is just hard to see when you're at this 4X magnification, so I had to memorize it in order to move everything into the right position, which isn't that big of a deal, but it would be nice if there was a way to like set the clip-on for what magnification you're using it at so that the menu would compress or condense down to the size that makes sense for that magnification. That's the only thing I would suggest. I'm not saying it's that big of a deal, especially if you're using an LPVO at 1x or something, it won't even matter. But if you are using like a prism optic, it can be a little difficult to see that menu for clip-on settings. And you can tell this was definitely designed with the intent of using it with an LPVO because of those lower magnification settings working better with this type of an optic. But I like my ACOG and I like fixed prism optics, so I want it to work with this, and it does. It just means you have to be a little bit, you know, strategic about how you set everything up while you're doing the programming within the optic itself. So those are the only real issues I have with it, and those aren't issues, they're just suggestions of how I would improve it. I don't think they're actually deal breakers. I think that they're just things that would make it even better. So that's something I wanted to make sure you were aware of because, you know, everyone's gonna have a different experience with this optic, but this has been mine. Now, let me tell you about a couple other good things with it that I didn't really go over during the philosophy of use conversation, because there are some other interesting benefits this thing brings to the table as well. So you get that high value versatility of being a clip-on, a monocular, or a scope. You've got that AI image enhancer. Now, I like that a lot, and I use it pretty much 100% of the time. What that is it takes the image and it enhances it using artificial intelligence algorithms or whatever else it is. But basically what it does is it helps to kind of outline and contrast certain objects from their surroundings or the background. So that way you can easily identify them and see them as being a separate object. And it is just a little bit more high def, and it does make it a little bit easier to identify things. So I like that a lot. And you have the option to turn it on or off. So whatever works best for you is great, but having the option is nice. And what I found is that I use it now exclusively because it's just better. So I like that a lot. Another thing that's cool is it's fully adjustable in the sense of brightness, sharpness, contrast, all that stuff that you usually want to, you know, mess with to get just the right amount of brightness or contrast or whatever it is to make your image better, you can do with this optic. And that brightness is kind of important because it does push some of the light from the screen back through your optic, and you can see it like hitting my eye when I'm showing you night vision footage. And that is something that, you know, kind of just happens regardless of anything you're going to be using that has illumination involved with an optic. So you kind of have to expect that. I mean, even the night vision itself does the same thing, right? Like shoots like some light back into your eye that you can see with other night vision devices. But it is something to be aware of. So that brightness level being able to be lowered during, you know, nighttime and stuff in order to remove more of that signature is a benefit. And you do have the option to do that. Now, one thing that's cool is that you can set an auto shut off on this thing. So you can set it to shut off after a certain amount of time. That way you don't waste batteries, especially if it's something you're not really thinking about and you just want to make sure that you're never in a situation where you accidentally leave it on. So you could use an auto shut off. That blue LED does kind of make it hard to forget about when it comes to shutting it off, but you might cover that up in order to avoid IR signature issues under night vision. And if you do, then having the auto shut off might be worth having in case it's something you're not constantly using. So just be aware of that. I think that's a good benefit. And what's cool is, unlike some other thermals I've used in the past, you hold the power button to turn this one on, and then you can just click it once to turn it off, and then you can just click it again, and it will turn right back on immediately without having to load up, because that's kind of just like a quick click off feature. It's not necessarily the power shutting off, it just puts it to sleep. So I like that a lot because I don't have to waste time waiting for the screen and everything to kick back in and load back up if I know I might be using it again very soon, but I don't want to just sit there with it on because of the light that it's broadcasting or because of, you know, maybe not needing it right that second, but I don't want to have to deal with like holding the button for a certain amount of time in order to turn it on and holding the button for a certain amount of time to turn it off. The quick click feature is very useful for that reason. So those things I think are really good about the Optic. Obviously it's got all the stuff, all the different color palettes, all the things you could want in a thermal, but the fact that you can use this as a monocular, as a clip-on, and as a scope, a standalone scope, is really quite impressive for the price point. And I really don't think you'll get a better thermal for $1,500 than what you see right here with the Hydra HS325, especially if you use the code MAGIC for 10% off. Now we're talking, what, $1,350? It's kind of hard to beat. I mean, it does everything that I would need from a thermal other than being helmet mounted. And that's the only thing that you really can't do with it. And I'm not personally super concerned about helmet mounted thermal, because if I needed that, I would have to spend a lot of money to get something worth doing that with, and that's just not something that's in my budget right now. So this is going to do 99% of anything else I might need a thermal for, and I like it quite a bit for that. So let me know in the comments below if you think my philosophies of use for thermal for prepared citizens is reasonable, because honestly, there's a lot of ways that you could prioritize thermal use for your personal situation. That's just my speculation, but you might have some other ideas that are, you know, more well-rounded or based on personal experience that might give me something to think about. So please make sure you leave that in the comments down below, because I'm always willing to learn and admit that I might be wrong about something if somebody has a better idea or some good explanations, right? And then the other thing I would like to hear about is if you've used the DNT optics, or if you're interested in them, you know, what your thoughts are about a dual thermal versus dedicated thermals, because yes, I think a dedicated scope and a dedicated clip-on and a dedicated monocular are going to do those jobs slightly better for different reasons, but that's a lot of money and a lot of logistics and a lot of equipment to have on hand, when this one can do all those things and you can keep it in your backpack and it'd be the only one you have with you, right? So I think that there's a benefit that the compromise makes worth compromising for. So anything else you need from me at all, go to magicprepper.com. Of course, there's a lot of interesting information and ways to support the channel there. I appreciate all of you for watching this video and for sharing or liking or doing any of the subscription type stuff that you might be willing to do, because it does help out quite a bit. And besides that, that's going to be it for Magic Prepper.